it was the wildest campaign in history, as we all know, just living through it, but even wilder behind closed doors, where I was able to go thanks to pretty unique access to the inner circles of Biden and Trump and Kamala Harris's top advisors as well. To me, it was stranger and wilder and more tragic than a classic cover-up.
Hi, everyone. For this episode of Next Question, I'm coming to you from my daughter and son-in-law's home in Los Angeles, where I'm visiting my 1-year-old grandson, Jay. So if you hear a baby crying or gurgling in the background, that is Jay. I think I hear him now. Or if you hear a dog barking, that is Ellie's and Mark's Wheaten Terrier, Ricky. So apologies in advance. Meanwhile, I'm super excited to talk to Chris Whipple. He is a historian slash journalist slash New York Times bestselling author. He's written a book called Uncharted, How Trump Beat Biden, Harris, and the Odds in the Wildest Campaign in History. It's really an inside look at what was happening primarily in the final year or so of the Biden administration, and why, despite all indications, or some indications to some people, not to everyone, he stayed in the race so long and gave Kamala Harris only 107 days, I think, to wage her campaign against Donald Trump. It's full of intrigue. It's really a fascinating read, not only about the Biden administration and the inner circle, if you will, but also what was going on in the Trump campaign. If you're a political junkie, or if you're just wondering how we got into the mess we're in right now, this is a must read. Chris Whipple, great to see you. Welcome to Next Question.
Great to be with you.
So I found this book so fascinating. I felt like a true fly on the wall when it came to the inner workings of not only the Biden administration, but also the Trump campaign at various points, as well as the Trump presidency. But I want to start by asking you about Joe Biden's inner circles desire to limit his exposure to the public and the press leading up to the 2024 campaign. You describe it as stranger and way more troubling than a cover-up. Can you explain to us this idea and help us understand what was actually going on behind the scenes?
Yeah, Katie, first of all, it's great to be with you. Thanks for having me. It was the wildest campaign in history, as we all know, just living through it, but even wilder behind closed doors, where I was able to go thanks to, pretty unique access to the inner circles of Biden and Trump and Kamala Harris's top advisors as well. To me, it was stranger and wilder and more tragic than a classic cover-up. I mean, when we think of cover-up in the Watergate sense, it's something that you know to be true and you're hiding from the public. What was different about this situation is that Joe Biden's inner circle, and I was able to spend time with all of them, virtually all of them. Most of them convinced themselves that Biden should run for re-election, that he could win the election, and that he could govern for another 4 years. Now, anybody who's had to take the keys away from an octogenarian grandfather, the car keys, knows that Biden was really too old to run for re-election, but they didn't believe it. And I'm talking now about Mike Donilon, his alter ego, Bruce Reed, Steve Ricchetti, Ron Klain, who's a major player in my book, as you know.
Anita Dunn.
Anita Dunn. They believed what they believed instead of their lying eyes.
Well, we'll talk about their motives later, but Obama's former chief of staff, Bill Daley, described the situation a bit more bluntly. He said every freaking one of them had no balls.
Yeah.
Do you agree?
It was a failure of leadership, as Leon Panetta put it to me, too. And he's one of the people I talk to about this. I love Daley because he's a truth teller, the no filter. He just tells you exactly what he's thinking. In this case, he was referring not only to Biden's inner circle, but I think principally he was referring to Democrats who failed to step up and challenge Biden for the nomination. Those were the ones who he said had no freaking balls. Um, but he also agrees that, when I talked to him about Biden's inner circle, I said, how is it possible? They knew what you were seeing. You couldn't unsee Biden's debate performance, that disaster on June 27th. Why did they do it? And Daley's best answer was, look, you're in the bubble. You've crossed the Rubicon. There's no going back. There is a kind of gravitational force when you're in that inner circle at the highest levels of power that is very seductive.
The book opens at former President Biden's debate session at Camp David. It was just days before that first presidential debate. Ron Klain, who was the former chief of staff, who was leading his debate prep, told you that Biden was pretty clueless about the administration's positions on a number of key issues like inflation. He didn't know what Trump had been saying. In other words, he really wasn't up to speed on not only what was going on in the country, but his own administration's positions. Can you set the scene for us and tell us about Ron Klain's horror at this realization?
Yeah, Ron Klain, who was a really effective White House chief of staff, in my view, and I know something about the history of White House chiefs for the first 2 years, painted this devastating portrait of Biden at Camp David in the days immediately preceding that fateful debate. Biden was out of it. Klain was startled. He'd never seen him so exhausted and out of touch. He didn't appear to be aware of what was going on in the campaign vis-a-vis Trump. At one point, he wanders out of Aspen Lodge, the presidential cabin, goes to the pool, collapses into an armchair, and falls sound asleep. This was in the middle of a session they were having. Klain lured him back that night, and they continued. But he really couldn't articulate what he wanted to do in a second term. And this was fascinating to me. He was obsessed with foreign leaders and what foreign leaders thought of him. At one point, Klain said half jokingly, I wondered if he thought he was president of NATO instead of president of the US. He was obsessed with Macron, Emmanuel Macron of France, and Olaf Scholz of Germany. And he said, well, they think I'm a great president. I must be a great president. At another point, I could go on, but at another point, Biden said, I've got an idea. And Klain said, what's that? If I look perplexed on camera during the debate, people will think Trump's an idiot. To which Klain replied, sir, if you look perplexed, people are just going to think you're perplexed. And that's our problem in this race.
It's just unbelievable to me that Ron Klain saw this. He knew there was trouble. And yet he never tried to convince Joe Biden to drop out of the race. How do you understand that disconnect?
That's why I say that this is stranger and wilder and more tragic than a cover-up in a sense. It's really hard to reconcile the two Ron Klains in my book. I mean, the first is the politically savvy former White House chief of staff who's been around the block and had prepared 8 presidential candidates, count them, over his career. Who saw just how wobbly and out of it Joe Biden was during the debate prep. How do you reconcile that with the Ron Klain who, a month later, in the final days and final hours of Biden's being on the ticket, fought a battle to save his reelection, to keep him on the ticket, believed that this wasn't, as Ron put it to me, it wasn't about Biden's age. It was a power grab by the elites, by the donors and and the conservative wing of the party. Ron Klain believed that. I think he and the other advisors had different reasons. I mean, that wasn't a universal take. But Biden believed somehow that if I'm sorry, Klain believed that somehow if Joe Biden could rally the progressives in the party and have them all walk out on the White House lawn with him, that he could salvage his reelection, his place at the top of the ticket, and win reelection, and evidently govern for another 4 years. It's hard to reconcile the politically smart, savvy Ron Klain with the guy who fought that battle right up until the 11th hour.
It's also hard to square this notion that Joe Biden could have endured the rigors of a campaign. You know, you write about the race in 2020. They had a reason to keep Joe Biden from traveling, from making a lot of public appearances, and that was COVID. But 2024 obviously was a whole different ballgame. And it sounds to me like even in 2020, he might not have withstood the exhaustion of a campaign, but clearly he was in better shape then than he was in 2024.
Yeah, Biden's campaign team knew that they caught a break in 2020 in the form of COVID because they could blame it on COVID. They could have Biden campaign from his basement and have a ready excuse for that. And there's an extraordinary scene in the book in which a campaign operative from the 2020 campaign comes and interviews for a top position in the 2024 campaign. She's in the Oval Office with Biden and his top advisors. And it takes this unexpectedly candid turn when one of them says to this applicant, this operative, listen, you know, in 2020, we had COVID. We had a great excuse to keep him in the basement. What do we do now? Look, they knew they had a problem with Biden. They knew that he was a shadow of himself on the stump and had been for a long time, and that he couldn't really do a traditional barnstorming campaign. I think the key distinction here is that some of those same people believed he could govern, he just couldn't campaign.
I want to get back to that catastrophic debate performance for a moment because that was, I think, a wake up call where there was a collective gasp when Joe Biden could not really articulate his views, and kind of that's when he said about, you know, saving Medicare, which had nothing to do with the question. I was surprised that even after that debate performance, his inner circle defended it. And Anita Dunn even told people that Joe Biden had won the debate. How could she think that in a million years, Chris?
Completely delusional. I think that it's hard to explain, but you are right. Everybody was shocked by that meltdown or whatever it was that Biden suffered during that debate, except his inner circle. They were still all in. And Anita Dunn, for example, was watching a so-called dial group, a focus group of undecided voters who were turning a dial one way or the other, up or down, registering their reaction in real time. She convinced herself that because the dials were turning down on the rest of the debate when Trump was being outrageous, that somehow Biden had won the debate, that they'd come out ahead. You know, other advisors said this was just a quote unquote bad night. It was like
Right.
Barack
People
Obama.
said he had a cold, right?
They said he was exhausted. But they literally said it was just a bad night. In other words, like Barack Obama's first debate against Mitt Romney, which was not great, but nothing like this complete moment of when Biden lost it. So anyway, it's a mystery. And that's what makes, I think, this story so fascinating to me. It's a study of, you know, at the heart of it is this question which readers can try to answer for themselves. But I invite everybody to pick up the book and read Ron Klain's description, his words, not mine, of Joe Biden during that debate prep, and ask themselves how that guy could believe that he could run for reelection and win.
Was it the desire of this inner circle to stay in power. And, I know during this whole chapter, people would point to Jill Biden and say, oh, it was Jill Biden's fault. They portrayed her as kind of a Lady Macbeth, ambitious in her own right. But after writing this, after talking to all these people, did you come to any conclusion? Was it different for every person? For Ron Klain, was it just this loyalty that couldn't be shaken? For others, was it their desire to stay empowered themselves? What was it?
Well, I think there's loyalty. There's no question about it. You could argue if you're cynical that it's a power grab, that these guys, their power derived from being in office with Joe Biden. I think that doesn't quite answer it because if you talk to these guys, as I did, and including months after the debate, months after Biden withdrew, you came away, I did. They were in this fog of delusion and denial, really convinced, some of them. I'm talking about Mike Donilon, Steve Ricchetti, Bruce Reed, convinced that Biden would have won that reelection. Uh, Months later, Mike Donilon was at Harvard at the Kennedy School speaking to an audience and said he thought the party had lost its mind. It walked away from a guy who won 81 million votes, the greatest vote getter in American history. So there is my friend Jack Watson, who was Jimmy Carter's last White House chief of staff, who should have been chief of staff on day one, once told me that there's a kind of almost magnetic force field when you're in that rarefied air of the White House and the Oval Office. It's an extraordinary compulsion to protect the president at all costs, and I think they lost their judgment here. I mean, they were delusional. These are guys who you would think. I'll give you a quick example of how, in 1988, one of the president's close friends, Ted Kaufman, perhaps his closest friends, when Biden was ensnared in that plagiarism scandal, it was Kaufman who said, "You know what, Joe? It's time. It's over." That never happened. That never happened this time around, and I don't know why not. They lost. They were clear-eyed veterans who lost their way.
You had an inkling that this was afoot when you were writing your first book called The Fight of His Life. And I know that you asked to interview Joe Biden, and this was in September of 2022. And this was about the first 2 years of his presidency, your first book on Biden. And they would only let you interview him if you submitted the questions in writing and he would respond in writing. So, did you not even interview Joe Biden for that first book?
I did. I interviewed him by email. I sent 8 questions in by email. I think it was 8. I got replies back. They were obviously replies that were, I presume, closely scrutinized by Ron Klain and maybe Anita Dunn, who knows who else, before they sent them back to me.
And who knows if he actually answered them?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure he answered them because I was talking to Ron Klain in real time, and he was describing meetings where he was going, "Come on, boss, you got to do these." And so I'm convinced they were his answers, but they were presumably cleaned up. Maybe that's unfair, but that's, I presume.
I wanted to share an interesting story that happened to me, Chris, when Joe Biden had yet to drop out of the race for the 2024 campaign. I saw him at an event where there were a lot of Stand Up to Cancer supporters, and I was invited, and I had never gone to a fundraiser, and I was interested in being an observer. And he did as he would do in all these different events, including like super casual events like the Irish event you talked about, where he had Irish politicians or politicians of Irish descent come to the White House. He used a teleprompter. He didn't answer any questions, but he saw me, and I've known him for decades. And he said, "I miss you." And I said, "Well, if you want to spend more time with me, why don't you do an interview with me and we can make up for lost time. And he said, I'd love that. After he was done giving the short speech to funders, he leaned over to me again and said, I really want to do an interview with you. So then I approached his press people. They then told me to call, and I got the runaround like there was no tomorrow. I got relegated to some guy who was in charge of digital interviews because it was for online and a podcast. And I wrote Anita Dunn personally, and I was very much stonewalled. And now reading your book, and obviously with the benefit of hindsight, I see why. And you write that he never did interviews with the New York Times or the Washington Post. Didn't he hold fewer press conferences than any president in history?
Yeah, I believe that's correct.
So, do you think the White House press corps and the media writ large should have been making more noise about this?
Well, first of all, you used the perfect word, stonewalled, when describing the Biden White House vis-a-vis the media. I really found it to be Nixonian in its contempt is not too strong a word for the press, the White House press corps. If you dared to suggest that Biden's age was an issue, they went after you. If you dared to write an op-ed that suggested that everything wasn't perfect, they would close you down. And I think it came from Anita Dunn. I think this was her. I mean, I think she was a much more powerful figure in the Biden White House than we realized at the time. So my guess, Katie, I mean, my hunch is that Biden would have done that sit down with you now, and that Dunn and the communications team shut that down in a heartbeat, and said, "No, you know, you will not be doing that." But that's the way this White House operated.
It is confounding that after the debate, I know Valerie Biden was absolutely apoplectic. She was his longtime supporter. Like, how come Valerie Biden didn't see the writing on the wall, Chris?
Well, so here's the thing, and this is why I say that this is different from a quote unquote cover up in the classic sense. There are some inconvenient truths to that theory. And one of them is the fact that behind closed doors, more often than not, Joe Biden governed capably. He was fine. I can tell you, I don't know, innumerable people, senators who came and met with him about Middle Eastern policy, who said he was on top of every I and T, crossing every T, and knew it cold and could articulate it very clearly. On the morning that his senior advisors, that fateful weekend of July 2021, when his advisors came to hammer out the abdication statement, that morning Biden was on the phone parsing the details of one of the most complicated prisoner swaps in history, multi-nation deal. Mike Donilon, who is his senior advisor, maybe closest political advisor, his alter ego, swears up and down that he never saw Joe Biden mentally diminished. Said he never saw it, period. Now, is he lying? Maybe. Is he delusional? Maybe. But that's his story. And you can't just wish these inconvenient things away in arguing that it's a classic cover up. I don't think it was.
I also think this is a very sensitive matter, as you described earlier, Chris. You know, when you have to handle taking the car keys away from an elderly parent, it is such an emotional situation, right? And you're dealing with someone who's aging, and I think you're aware that you don't want to be ageist, that you don't want to accuse someone of losing their faculties. I mean, the whole thing is just so fraught. And I think this was a microcosm of conversations that are had every day and around the dinner table or the living room sofa when you have to talk to an aging parent. And I think it was this situation on steroids, don't you?
Yeah, so no question about it. It exponentially magnified by the stakes involved, not just power for the people around Biden, but the future of the country and the fate of the world. I mean, I'm not exaggerating. I mean, those were the stakes here. Joe Biden's legacy, the Democratic Party's future, the result of the 2024 election, and the fate of the country and the world. Put all those things together, and that's tougher than taking the car keys.
You also write about the complicated relationship Joe Biden had with Barack Obama. I thought that was a really interesting thing. I obviously read about this and heard about it through the years, but Joe Biden really never forgave Barack Obama for putting his support behind Hillary Clinton in 2016 before Joe Biden had truly had the time after the death of his son, Beau, from brain cancer to make a decision about whether he was in or whether he was out. Is that accurate?
Yes, absolutely true. Biden never forgave Barack Obama for that, for putting his thumb on the scale for Hillary. And it's a complicated relationship. On the one hand, they had a genuine bond that resulted when Beau, after Beau's death, and before Beau's death, actually, when Barack Obama offered to pay for Beau's treatment and whatever he needed, Obama was going to help out. They became very close. But then again, he never forgave him for 2016. And in the end, this is why the story is so Shakespearean, and because it's full of betrayals, and one of them was Joe Biden's belief that Barack Obama betrayed him, that he was working behind the scenes to force him out. And the thing that one of Joe Biden's closest friends told me, that the thing that really got to Biden was not so much George Clooney writing a brutal op-ed in the New York Times, maybe with Obama's complicit uh, uh, consent, but it was the fact that in the end, when the walls were closing in, Barack Obama never picked up the phone and called Joe and said, "Hey, Joe, listen, you sure you're up to this?" If he had reservations, he never shared them with Joe.
Why do you think that was? Because if they did have some kind of friendship, and if Barack Obama cared about the future of the Democratic Party, you would think he would take a more active role in at least questioning Joe Biden's decision.
Well, the best guess I can give you on that, Katie, is that there was this tension, this conflict between the Biden and Obama camps. And perhaps Obama felt that it would be counterproductive, that the best way to ensure that Biden stayed in the race might be Obama telling him to get out. That might have been the thinking involved.
Yeah, you write about how the Obama team never understood Joe Biden's appeal and that they didn't find him to be very sophisticated, which I felt was ironic given the fact that the Democratic Party has lost its hold on working class voters. And that was obviously one of Joe Biden's big strong suits, the guy from Scranton, Pennsylvania, who could talk to the average working Joe, literally. And yet people in the Obama camp didn't seem to appreciate that and kind of were condescending in a way that working class voters have felt the Democratic Party had become in general, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, they looked down their noses at Joe, Scranton Joe. They didn't think he had it. And at one point, David Plouffe was dispatched to go talk to Biden. This was around the time of the 2016 race. And Plouffe sat down with Biden and said to him, "Joe, you don't really want to end your," basically said, you couldn't win this. And you don't want to end your career in an Iowa hotel room, do you?" And Biden was just furious about this. And as one of his aides said to me, he hates the Davids. the Davids being Fluff and Axelrod.
Interesting. And David Axelrod was pretty vocal about
Yeah.
think his thoughts that Joe Biden should bow out. Finally, it was Nancy Pelosi who really, I guess, put the nail in the coffin, if you will. Tell us about what you know about that conversation when she spoke to Biden face to face and basically delivered the tough language and the tough words that it was time to take away the car keys or give up his run for reelection in this case.
Yeah, it's a story that I report for the first time in Uncharted. The previous reporting had suggested that this was a phone call that Pelosi had had with Biden. What I learned was that she went and she had this clandestine meeting with Joe Biden. She went to the White House, not to the Oval Office, where she might be seen, but they arranged to meet in the residence. It was July 11, was the same day, coincidentally, that Nancy Pelosi went on Morning Joe and was asked by Jonathan Lemire whether Biden should run again, and she said, "Oh, words to the effect of, it's his decision. We're waiting for him to decide." After Biden had already made it clear, emphatically clear, that he was running. So she masterfully put the ball back in his court, knowing that the pressure was going to be overwhelming for him eventually to step aside. But later that day, she went to the White House. They met privately. She said to a friend, because nobody would confirm this meeting until Jeff Zients finally reluctantly confirmed it to me. She said, "We had a long talk about America." And in her inimitable way, she went down memory lane with the president. They talked about history. They talked about their shared Catholic faith. They talked about all kinds of things. And she said, not in a boasting way, but she said to a friend later thereafter, "I'm the only one who could have sent that message. He trusts me." And she left without any kind of, Biden was still digging in, but she left thinking that she'd gotten through to him. And it was 10 days later. Took another long 10 days, and I tell the whole story of the drama of those 10 days before Biden ultimately stepped aside.
I thought that Kamala Harris handled this uncertain chapter really well because she did have to walk a delicate tightrope. And you right, the vice president was navigating a political minefield. The slightest misstep, any hint that she was plotting to replace the president could have been politically fatal. But while Harris was lying low, her political operation was working behind the scenes. Her chief of staff, Lorraine Bowles, had been thinking about a contingency like this since November 19th, 2021. And that was, by the way, when President Biden, under Section 3 of the 25th Amendment, had voluntarily transferred his powers and duties to Harris while he underwent a colonoscopy. Yay, glad he got his colonoscopy. But what do you make of Kamala Harris's ability to continue to support the president? She obviously knew what was going on, I'm assuming. She insisted that he was all there, that he was fully capable, fully functioning. And yet she knew that if anything were to happen, there was a good chance that she would step in his place.
Well, as I wrote, as you quoted from the book, she was really treading through a minefield. She had no choice other than to be completely 100% supportive. She had to be Caesar's wife, during this whole walk up to the decision that he made. But she was clear-eyed enough to know that that day might be coming. She didn't know when it would happen. And on July 21st, when she did get the phone call, she was ready. They had a whole team that sprang into action around the dining room table at the Naval Observatory, working the phones, the laptops, reaching out to everybody across the country. They'd already had operatives out very carefully and quietly who could not be traced to Kamala Harris. They were already out there, and they checked out the rules and where the money would go and all the rest of it. And they also were pressuring some Democratic senators to turn on Biden. And So anyway, that I report that in the book. But the result of all that is that when that phone call came, when she was standing in the kitchen of the Naval Observatory on the 21st of July, they were ready to go. And it was a tour de force that in the next 48 hours, she really nailed down the nomination.
I thought she did an incredible job. And of course, during that period of the campaign, everyone was saying this was the Trump campaign's nightmare. They wanted Donald Trump to run against Joe Biden, and they didn't want a more capable candidate. Um, but
Trump was furious. Trump was furious, and he thought it was a coup. He thought he was being cheated. He said to Paul Manafort, it was another strange story in this book. He said to Paul Manafort, his disgraced ex-campaign chief, who was working with him again, he said, "Oh, so now I have to win the election three times." The first time in his mind was beating Biden. The second was beating the courts. The third was now I have to beat her.
And she was a formidable candidate initially. Do you think if there had been the so-called mini primary, which a lot of people wondered if there was even time for that at that point in the campaign, would have been better and people would have felt more, I guess, invested in the Democratic nominee?
So I think the only question, Katie, is would the Democrats have been better off a year earlier or maybe 2 years earlier when there would have been time for a real competition and a real Democratic primary? It was too late in July of 2024. It was impossible and to have a so-called mini primary. And if you looked at the rules, and I was told by people high up in the DNC who understand this stuff, that it couldn't have been done. It was just impossible. The money was all going to Harris, to the second person on the. It wasn't really conceivable to have a mini primary. So the real question is, why didn't Joe Biden step aside a year earlier or two?
Right. And then we get back to the beginning of our conversation about it being hard to give up power, not only for his inner circle, but for Joe Biden himself. I wanted to ask you also, Chris, about Kamala Harris's navigation of praising her administration, but also separating herself from it. Famously, she was asked on The View a question that I think haunted her throughout the campaign.
Would you have done something differently than President Biden during the past 4 years?
There is not a thing that comes to mind in terms of, and I've been a part of most of the decisions that have had impact.
Yeah.
The work that we have done, for example, capping the cost of insulin at $35 a month for our seniors is something I care deeply about allowing Medicare to negotiate drug prices.
Yes.
And bring the cost of prescription medication down for seniors, but my intention is to expand that for all Americans.
Mm-hmm.
You write that Joe Biden had even given her permission to basically differentiate herself as a candidate. On the other hand, that is so tricky, Chris. I feel for her because she can't shed all over the Biden administration, of which she was a part, without looking like a turncoat. And, I think it was very difficult for her to pick places where she could have differentiated herself. I guess she could have said, in retrospect, we could have done more on the border, right? But it's really hard because anything she says is going to be twisted and is going to be taken by the opposition as being disloyal or criticizing the very administration she was a part of, right?
Well, nobody said it would be easy, but think of again, I was right before Joe Biden dropped out. I was writing a different book about presidential campaign managers through history, and I was looking at the 1968 race. And Hubert Humphrey broke with Lyndon Johnson famously late in the campaign. It was in October of 1968, and he almost caught Richard Nixon in an election that he lost by a hair's breadth. But it was a real surge, and I think that she could have done something like that, but nobody's saying it would have been easy. The irony here is that not only not only was she prepared to answer that question on The View, 7 Ways to Sunday, because they knew it was coming. But Lorraine Voles, her chief of staff, and Jen O'Malley Dillon had gone to the White House and met with Jeff Zients, the chief of staff, and they were told, and they were going in effect for permission to separate themselves from Biden. And Zients and others told them, do what you have to do. We get it. We understand. And Biden personally called Kamala Harris and said, hey, go for it. If you have to do it, you have to do it. And I'm paraphrasing. I don't know. She couldn't do it. And I'm told by the people who know her well that what it came down to was loyalty, that she couldn't throw Joe Biden under the bus. So she couldn't. And what she said, of course, was, I can't think of a single thing that she would have done differently. And it was devastating. Within hours, the Trump campaign had a commercial up with that sound in it. And it was the death knell for a change campaign. Somebody, if you're trying to run on change, you can't give that answer.
What should she have said?
Well, that's why they don't pay me the big buck. But I think she probably could have said something to the effect of, look, we've done A, B, C, and D, but you know what? We blew it on inflation, and here's what I'm going to do. I think it was probably too late for her to convince anyone that she was going to be tough on the border. That was probably a lost cause. But if you had to choose one thing, in my view, it wouldn't have been Gaza. It would have been inflation.
But how much could they have really controlled inflation? In fairness, maybe, I don't know. My mom used to say,
no,
the president doesn't make the economy makes the president.
No, that's true, except when they're destroying the economy, of course, with tariffs. But anyway, I mean, I think that, no, you have to be caught trying, I think is the point at the end of the day. Even if you and I know that there's very little the president can do about that, you have to be caught trying.
In addition to talking a lot about, obviously, the Biden presidency and campaign, Chris, you also focus on Donald Trump, the first administration, and his 2024 campaign chairs, Susie Wiles and Chris LaCivita. I had forgotten that Chris LaCivita was the architect of the Swift Boat campaign against John Kerry. Can you remind people what that was all about?
Yeah, this was Chris LaCivita's claim to fame, this devastating ad campaign that he launched against John Kerry in 2004. Kerry, of course, was the Democratic nominee who went to the convention and said, reporting for duty. He was running on his military record, and LaCivita, by rounding up people in the military at the time who didn't like John Kerry, managed to turn it into a strike against him. They all disputed Kerry's claims that he was of his exploits in Vietnam as captain of a so-called Swift boat. It was called the Swift Boat Veterans for Truth, and it was not truthful, but extremely effective. And LaCivita really became a kind of hero for having created it within the GOP. So now fast forward to the 2024 campaign, and suddenly there's a devastating ad campaign about trans surgery for inmates, in which Kamala is captured in her own words, advocating the right of prisoners to have trans surgery, and use with her words, it was devastating. Of course, ended with the tagline, "She's for they, them. Trump is for you." And when that happened, I know one former winning Democratic presidential campaign manager who said to me off the record, that was their inability to answer that was just crazy. And he called Jen O'Malley Dillon and her gang and said, "What are you doing? You got to answer this." And the reply he got was, well, there is no answer for it. So we're just going to let that go.
You also write about Susie Wiles, who is such an interesting figure in politics. She's the daughter of Pat Summerall, the famed sportscaster, who was also an alcoholic. And that, in many ways, helped her navigate Trump's aggression and his erratic moods. How would you describe her relationship with Donald Trump? And why do you think she's been so effective? And he clearly trusts her, right?
Susie Wiles is a fascinating story, really amazing. And she has some kind of magic with Trump. He trusts her. He has stood by her. She has, there's never been any real worry that she would be fired by Trump. And she has a kind of magic with him. And I think part of it, without meaning to sound like an armchair psychologist, I think part of it goes back to the way she handled her alcoholic father, who was very difficult. I think she'd be the first to admit it. Children of alcoholics have a real sensitivity and a kind of antenna for what they can control and what they can't. And she has found that modus operandi with Donald Trump, which he's carried on into the White House. But of course, look, you could argue that as White House Chief of Staff, she should be telling the president hard truths much more often than she might be.
You also write about how you were invited to Jared Kushner's and Ivanka Trump's home several times during Trump's first term, which I found fascinating. How many times did you visit with them, Chris, in their home? And what do you think they really wanted to understand? I guess you write that they wanted to understand the inner workings of the White House, how I guess they could create some discipline in what they saw as sort of the chaos. But what do you think they were after? What did you all talk about all the time? And how many times again did you visit them?
I don't know. I would say nobody, first of all, nobody was more surprised than I to get this email from the White House from Ivanka's assistant and then being invited to their place. But I went many times, maybe more than a dozen times. I visited with them, and it was an irresistible opportunity to get some insight into the Trump White House. And I think it was different. I think in Ivanka's case, I think she was surprised and somewhat encouraged to learn that they weren't the first White House to have all kinds of all hell breaking loose and internecine warfare and backstabbing. And I think I think it helped her to put their experience into perspective. In Jared's case, I think he was trying to navigate this chaotic, very dangerous White House and deal with the chiefs of staff that he had to deal with. And so I think they thought they could learn something. And I thought I could learn something from them and that I would get them eventually to go on the record. And I never really did get them to agree.
Why did they decide to basically kind of separate themselves from Trump world ultimately?
Well, I've been told that essentially it comes down to the success that Jared has had with his company. And of course, he's had a major infusion of funds from the Saudis, as we all know, controversially. But he's doing quite well, thank you very much, in his business career. And I think for Ivanka, I think it was a rough ride. I think the first 4 years are not something she's eager to repeat. It was I think, emotionally difficult period for her.
Getting back to Susie Wiles, is she the only one left? You mentioned maybe she should be speaking out more. Maybe there is no one left, Chris, who provides some of the constraints that a leader like Donald Trump needs. He got rid of all the people who challenged him in his first term. he is as unrestrained as ever, it seems, and has surrounded himself with sycophants and clearly, people who are affirming and supporting everything he does and telling him basically what he wants to hear. I guess Susie Wiles isn't that person. Is there anyone at all who's trying to do that in this current White House?
Very few is my observation. Although Susie Wiles claims that she's trying and that she pushes back, and I've talked to her off and on, and quite recently, and she is trying. She says to it's interesting. She told me that one of the first people she called was Jim Baker, James A. Baker III, Reagan's White House chief before she took the job. Everybody does that. And Baker always tells them the same thing. Congratulations, you've got the worst blanking job in Washington. Multiply that by 20, at least, in her case. So she's told me that she's pushed back on a number of major Trump initiatives. She's had some success in moderating some of Trump's decisions. And in other cases, as she put it, tie goes to the president. So we will see.
You've done a deep dive into the Democratic Party from the 2024 perspective. How do you see the party digging out of this mess? Are there people who you're looking to, Chris, as the future stars of the Democratic Party? It seems like people are desperate for leadership, or certainly someone who is standing up to Donald Trump and more than that, organizing the so-called resistance. Do you see anyone emerging from the pack?
I don't know that I'd see anyone in particular emerging at this point, but it's a really deep bench of talent. I mean, there are really so many promising Democrats out there, but I think I would disagree with my pal James Carville. I don't think the best strategy is to lie low and let Trump dig himself into a hole from which he can't climb out. I think it's important to be out there, and I think just look at the recent marches,
protests.
Look at Bernie Sanders and AOL and their
AOC.
I'm sorry. What did I say?
AOL.
Look at
you're showing our age, Chris.
Yeah, really. Look at Bernie Sanders and AOC and their anti-oligarchy tour. I think whatever you may think of them, they have a really clear, understandable message. And I think other Democrats are going to have to get out there and do the same thing.
Well, Chris Whipple, the book is called Uncharted: How Trump Beat Biden, Harris, and the Odds in the Wildest Campaign in History. And now we're experiencing, I think, the ramifications of that campaign and that election, full stop. Thank you so much for giving us the inside scoop on what was happening in both campaigns. I found it a fascinating read, and I'm so grateful you spent this time with us.
Katie, thanks so much. I'm grateful to you. Great to be with you.